Can objective morality piggyback on epistemology? The companions in guilt argument and the realism-anti-realism debate. Introduction. The companions in guilt argument, CGA, is one of the more elegant maneuvers in the moral realist's toolkit. Rather than arguing directly that moral facts exist, it argues indirectly. It points out that our reasoning practices already commit us to objective, mind-independent normative facts of some kind, namely, epistemic norms like believe what the evidence supports. If we accept that epistemic normativity is real and objective, the argument goes, we no longer have principled grounds to reject moral normativity on the same basis. The two stand or fall together, as companions in guilt, or companions in innocence. This essay lays out the anti-realists' main lines of resistance, the realists' countermoves, and the deeper methodological commitments that keep the debate at a stalemate. The companions in guilt argument itself is used here as the anchor and starting point. It's the sharpest, most literature-tested version of the parity move, but the essay also brings in two further considerations that touch the same territory, without restating the CGA itself. A practical indispensability argument about what objectivity does for deliberation and social life, and Derek Parfit's non-metaphysical cognitivism, which questions whether the CGA's underlying demand, that normative claims need existing facts to back them, was ever the right demand to make. These should be kept distinct from the CGA, and from each other. Treating overlapping conclusions as if they were the same argument, or as mutually reinforcing evidence, would overstate how unified the realist's case actually is. What moral facts are, and are not. Moral facts, as realists use the term, are truths about right and wrong that hold independent of anyone's beliefs, desires, or culture. Wrongness is a genuine feature of an act, not a report of how someone happens to feel about it. Non-natural realists take this to require mind-independent, non-spatio-temporal, causally inert properties known through something like rational intuition, on close analogy with how Platonists treat numbers. Naturalist, Cornell, realists keep the same commitment to objectivity, but grounded in ordinary natural properties instead. Wrongness just as some complex, empirically discoverable pattern, such as causing suffering or breaking trust, knowable the way any other worldly fact is knowable. Parfit's non-metaphysical cognitivism agrees that moral claims are objectively true but denies that either kind of existence is required at all, treating moral truths as true in the same deflationary sense mathematical truths are true, without a truthmaker standing behind them. Moral facts on any of these views are not the same as personal preferences, cultural conventions, or emotional expressions. That is precisely what separates realism from error theory, which holds that moral claims are meaningful, but uniformly false, because no such facts exist, and from emotivism, which holds that moral claims are not truth-apt at all, only dressed-up approval or disapproval. Nor are they, on the realist picture, reducible to what a society happens to agree on, what maximizes evolutionary fitness, or what a rational contract among self-interested parties would produce. These are the naturalistic and conventionalist substitutes anti-realists offer as complete explanations of moral practice, built precisely to avoid positing facts of the first kind. Quasi-realism occupies an odd middle position here. It denies moral facts in the strong, mind-independent sense, while insisting the practical difference is smaller than it sounds, since moral talk can behave exactly like fact-stating talk without being metaphysically underwritten by any fact at all. How the anti-realist tries to break the parity. The anti-realist's task is to show that epistemic and moral normativity are not really in the same boat, that you can keep the epistemic facts and jettison the moral ones without inconsistency. Four strategies do most of the work. Epistemic instrumentalism treats epistemic oughts as hypothetical rather than categorical. On this view, you ought to believe the evidence is shorthand for if you want true beliefs. You ought to believe the evidence, a conditional recommendation, not a standing cosmic command. Since instrumental norms don't carry the strange, categorical authority realists attribute to moral facts, the parity dissolves before it starts. Constitutivism takes a different route. It argues that following epistemic norms is simply part of what it means to believe something, or to reason at all. You cannot form a belief while flatly rejecting the norms of truth and validity. Doing so isn't rule-breaking. It's failing to believe in the first place. Moral norms have no equivalent relationship to action. You can act while flatly rejecting moral norms, without ceasing to be an agent. The disanalogy on this view is built into the very structure of the two domains. Bullet biting is the more austere option, typically favored by error theorists. Rather than trying to save epistemic objectivity, while discarding moral objectivity, the bullet biter accepts that both are equally suspect. If the argument against objective moral facts generalizes to objective epistemic facts, so be it. Global skepticism about categorical normativity is the price of metaphysical honesty, and it's a price worth paying. Disanalogy and entanglement arguments simply deny the premise that the two domains are similar enough to be companions in the first place. Moral properties and epistemic properties differ in their motivational profile, their relationship to the natural sciences, and the kind of disagreement they generate. If the domains were never twins, there's no contradiction in treating them differently. Quasi-realism and expressivism take a fifth route that doesn't fit neatly alongside the other four, because it doesn't try to win the parity argument at all, it tries to make the parity argument relevant. Associated with Simon Blackburn and Alan Gibbard, quasi-realism grants that moral talk functions exactly like talk about objective facts. It supports inference, embeds in conditionals, and sounds categorical rather than optional, but it denies that this functional profile requires mind-independent moral properties to explain it. On this view, moral commitments are fundamentally attitudes, roughly, sophisticated states of approval and disapproval, and quasi-realists then earn the right to talk as if these attitudes were objective facts, without needing the metaphysics realism demands. If quasi-realism succeeds, the CGA loses its bite entirely. There's no need to explain away the parity between morality and epistemology. because neither domain needs realist truthmakers to explain why we treat its claims as categorical. Guilt or innocence, two framings of the same move. The introduction's parenthetical companions in guilt or companions in innocence names a real fork in how the style of parody argument gets run, and it's worth resolving rather than leaving as a stylistic aside. Run as companions in guilt, the argument works as a threat. If you reject moral facts on some ground G, and epistemic facts share exactly the features picked out by G, then you must reject epistemic facts too. A conclusion almost no one is willing to accept, which is meant to force the anti-realist back toward accepting moral facts instead. The disanalogy strategy above is the natural escape hatch from this framing. Deny that G is really shared, and the threat never gets off the ground. Run as companions in innocence, the same parody claim is offered constructively rather than as a threat. Instead of asking what the anti-realist would have to sacrifice, it starts from what they already comfortably accept, that epistemic facts are objective and legitimate, innocent of the charges anti-realists bring against morality, and argues that since moral facts share the relevant profile, they inherit that same innocence by extension. Some philosophers prefer this framing on the grounds that nothing is literally guilty of anything in this argument. The whole point is mutual standing, not shared blame. So innocence is arguably the more accurate label even though guilt is the more common one in the literature. The two framings are logically equivalent, same parody premise, same conclusion, but they place the argumentative burden differently. Guilt puts the anti-realist on the defensive, forced to accept an unpalatable trade-off. Innocence puts the realist on the front foot. Offering a positive analogy, the anti-realist is free to simply decline by rerunning the disanalogy move. Neither framing adds new content to the argument. They change who has to move first, which is why this essay treats the choice as a matter of rhetorical emphasis, rather than a further consideration in its own right. Alongside the practical indispensability and parfait material, how the realist pushes back. Moral realists, with Terence Cuneo as a central figure, argue that each of these escape routes either fails on its own terms or collapses into self-contradiction. Against instrumentalism, realists raise what might be called the evidentiary categoricalness problem. Someone standing in a field during a thunderstorm, who sees lightning has a reason to believe it's raining regardless of whether they care about the weather at all. Evidence seems to obligate belief independent of the believer's goals. This connects to the goal regress problem. If all epistemic reasons are instrumental, then the reason to be rational is itself only binding on those who happen to want to be rational. But there is no further, non-arbitrary reason to want that, which threatens to make the entire edifice of science and logic a matter of brute personal preference. Underlying both points is Cuneo's broader symmetrical queerness claim. Whatever features supposedly make moral properties metaphysically queer non-natural, causally inert, known through some special faculty, epistemic properties like justification and evidential support turn out to have those same features. If queerness is disqualifying, it should disqualify both domains equally. If it isn't disqualifying enough to sink epistemology, there's no principled reason it should sink morality either. What queerness actually claims. It's worth pausing on what queerness is actually accusing realism of, since the term gets used as a label more often than it gets unpacked. J.L. Mackey's original argument, from which the whole tradition borrows the word, has two separate parts. The metaphysical half says that objective values, if they existed, would have to be entities, or qualities utterly unlike anything else in the universe, unlike tables, forces, or even other natural properties like being poisonous or being red. The epistemological half says that knowing such properties would require some special faculty of moral perception or intuition, categorically different from sense perception inference, or any other way humans come to know things. Mackey's point was that positing both a strange kind of property and a strange kind of faculty to detect it is exactly the kind of move good metaphysics should be suspicious of. This matters because realists don't all respond to the queerness charge the same way, and the paper so far has only been discussing one of two live options. Non-natural realism, the view associated with Cuneo and, in a different form, early Enoch, accepts that moral properties are exactly as queerness describes, mind-independent, non-spatio-temporal, causally inert, known by something like rational intuition, rather than empirical observation. This is a specific and demanding ontological commitment, closely parallel to mathematical Platonism, and it's the version Mackey's argument was built to target. The symmetrical queerness reply works by saying, fine, but epistemic properties are queer in exactly this sense too. So the cost is shared rather than unique to ethics. Naturalist Cornell realism, associated with Richard Boyd, David Brink, and Nicholas Sturgeon, takes the opposite strategy. Instead of defending the queer properties, it denies moral properties are non-natural to begin with. On this view, moral properties, like wrongness, just are complex natural properties. Something like causing suffering, violating trust, undermining flourishing, cashed out in thoroughly empirical terms, knowable through ordinary inference to the best explanation the same way we know about diseases are historical causes, and fully embedded in the causal order. If this is right, queerness never gets a foothold, because there's no non-natural property or special faculty being posited in the first place, though critics reply that this move tends to buy its safety by making moral properties suspiciously easy to reduce to purely descriptive facts, which raises Moray's open question worry in a different guise. Locating these two options side by side clarifies what's at stake in Parfit's move discussed below. He isn't choosing between non-natural and Cornell realism so much as trying to reject the shared assumption that moral truth requires either a queer property or a natural one, that both options take for granted. Against bullet biting, realists press the self-defeat objection. An error theorist who denies objective epistemic facts is, in the very act of arguing for that denial, relying on the idea that arguments should move us, because they are logically sound or well-evidenced, an implicitly objective epistemic standard. asserting you should believe this argument while denying that there are objective reasons to believe anything is not consistent scholarship. It's using the latter to kick away the latter. It's worth flagging, though, that this objection quietly assumes assertion itself requires categorical epistemic backing, a premise the realist needs, but hasn't independently earned. A committed error theorist can reply that assertion only requires pragmatic or conversational warrant, not objective truth tracking, in which case the letter-kicking charge has less force than it first appears to. The Schmagency maneuver in full. Against constitutivism, David Enoch's Schmagency objection is worth walking through carefully, since a great deal rests on exactly how the thought experiment does its work. Constitutivism about practical reason, developed by people like Christine Korsgaard and, in a different form, Michael Smith, argues that the norms of good agency aren't external impositions, they're built into what it is to act at all. To act on this view is to aim at something as good, to try to unify your desires into a coherent will, to treat your future self as continuous with your present one. You cannot simply opt out of these norms while still counting as an agent, any more than you can opt out of the rules of chess while still playing chess. So the norms bind categorically, not because some external fact commands them, but because rejecting them just means you've stopped agents. Enoch's reply is to invent a companion creature, the Schmagent. A Schmagent is exactly like an agent in every functional respect. It deliberates, acts on reasons, pursues goals, except that it doesn't care whether it counts as a real agent in the constitutivist's technical sense. It has no interest in unifying its will or achieving the practical identity Korsgaard describes. It just wants what it wants, and acts to get it, indifferent to whether this satisfies the constitutive standard for agency. The Schmagent asks, why should I want to be an agent in your sense, rather than a Schmagent? This is the crux. The constitutivist's whole strategy depends on saying, you can't escape these norms, because escaping them means you're no longer an agent. But the Schmagent doesn't care about that consequence. Being told you'd cease to be an agent only bites if being an agent, rather than a Schmagent, is already something you have reason to want, and that's precisely the further, substantive normative claim constitutivism was supposed to avoid needing. It's smuggled in exactly the stance-independent fact. You ought to care about being a real agent that it promised to derive from the bare structure of action itself. The parallel move for epistemic constitutivism, sometimes labeled the Schmief case, runs the same script over belief rather than action. Epistemic constitutivists claim that anyone who has beliefs is already committed to norms of truth and evidence, because believing just is aiming at truth. You can't believe something while being indifferent to whether it's true, any more than you can intend something while being indifferent to whether you do it. Enoch's rejoinder invents the Schmiever, a creature functionally identical to a believer. It stores representations, updates them in response to input, uses them to guide behavior, except it has no interest in whether those representations are true, only in whether they're useful, comforting, or otherwise congenial. The Schmiever asks the same question in a new key. Why should I want to be a believer rather than a Schmiever? Two replies are worth registering before moving on, since the argument isn't cost-free for the realist either. The who cares reply. A constitutivist might simply grant that Schmagents and Schmievers are possible and shrug, humans, as a matter of fact, are agents and believers, not Schmagents and Schmievers, so the norms still bind us. This trades the ambition of a fully universal, rationally inescapable norm for a more modest claim index to the kind of creature we happen to be, which is a real concession, but perhaps a survivable one. The regress doesn't obviously favor realism. Even if Schmagency shows constitutivism can't derive categorical norms for free, it doesn't yet show realism is true, only that constitutivism, specifically, fails as a non-realist route to categorical normativity. An anti-realist could accept the Schmagency point and retreat to instrumentalism or bullet-biting, rather than to realism. So the thought experiment narrows the anti-realist's options without forcing them all the way to the realist's door. Korsgaard's own reply. Constitutivists have not simply conceded the point. Korsgaard's response is that Schmagency isn't a coherent alternative to begin with. Anything capable of deliberating, weighing reasons, and acting for purposes, just as exhibiting the practical identity constitutivism describes, whether or not it labels itself an agent. On this view, the Schmagent is not a genuine rival possibility, but a redescription of an agent that refuses to notice what it's already doing, which if right, means the Schmagent's question, why be an agent rather than a Schmagent, never gets off the ground, because there was no coherent Schmagent there to ask it. None of this fully resolves the exchange, and it isn't meant to. Schmagency is one of the few places in this debate where the realists' best move and the constitutivists' best reply leave things genuinely open, rather than one side clearly winning. Finally, realists sometimes broaden the battlefield, rather than defend it head-on. Introducing prudential reasons, Guy Fletcher's contribution as a further companion. Even if epistemology is somehow disanalogous to morality, self-interested reasons, like the reason to put out a fire that is currently burning you, seem just as categorical and just as hard to reduce to mere preference. If prudence survives the same skeptical pressure that's meant to destroy moral realism, the anti-realist selective skepticism starts to look at hoc. The deeper disagreement, one web or two. Underneath the back and forth sits a genuinely deep methodological split about how to weigh competing intellectual commitments. The anti-realist is animated by metaphysical parsimony. On this picture, reality is exhausted by causes, particles, and organisms with desires. There is no further category of invisible commands floating above the natural order. Evolutionary biology, neuroscience, and sociology can explain why humans feel bound by moral and epistemic norms, without needing those norms to correspond to anything objectively real. Better on this view to bite the bullet of skepticism, or to reduce all normativity to instrumental tool use, than to admit queer non-natural properties into an otherwise clean scientific picture. The realist is animated by the inescapability of reason. The moment you argue, evaluate evidence, or take a position to be justified, you are already operating as though there are objectively correct and incorrect ways to do those things. If that commitment is itself an objective epistemic fact, the realist argues, there's no further principled barrier to allowing objective facts about how humans ought to behave toward each other. Denying objective normativity in order to eliminate morality risks eliminating the very rational standing needed to argue that anything is true, including the anti-realist's own thesis. Each side, in effect, treats a different intellectual virtue as fundamental. The realist prioritizes trust in our strongest intuitions and the coherence of rational practice, treating any theory that undermines those as self-refuting. The anti-realist prioritizes trust in the physical sciences and Occam's razor, treating any unfalsifiable property as suspect on sight. Because the dispute is partly about which starting point deserves default authority, it resists a clean resolution from within either framework. Parfit's third path, non-metaphysical cognitivism. Derek Parfit's contribution in On What Matters doesn't fit neatly into the realist, anti-realist, quasi-realist trichotomy, already on the table, and it's worth treating separately because it changes what the whole debate is arguing about. The convergence argument. Anti-realists sometimes argue that our moral beliefs can be fully explained by evolutionary and cultural pressures that had nothing to do with tracking moral truth. We believe incest is wrong, roughly, because ancestors who felt that way left more descendants, not because they detected a fact. Parfit's reply is that this kind of genealogical debunking proves, too much of it proves anything. Our confidence in basic logical and mathematical truths, that contradictions can't both be true, that 1 + 2 = 3, also has a thoroughly natural, evolutionary ideology. Nothing about natural selection cared whether early humans grasped modus ponens for its own sake, only that reasoning this way helped them survive. If an evolutionary origin story is enough to debunk moral confidence, it should equally debunk logical and mathematical confidence, and almost no one is prepared to go that far. Parfit takes this as a sign that the debunking strategy is malformed at the root, not merely difficult to run against morality specifically. Non-metaphysical cognitivism. Parfit's more distinctive move, though, is to reject a shared assumption both the realist and the anti-realist bring to the table, that a normative claim being true requires some corresponding fact to exist, in the same sense that tables and electrons exist. Realists accept this demand and try to meet it, hence the queer, non-natural properties critics complain about. Anti-realists accept the same demand and conclude morality fails to meet it. Parfit instead argues that asking whether normative truths exist in a heavyweight ontological sense is a category mistake, akin to asking where the number 7 is located, or what mass the rule of modus ponens has. Mathematical and logical truths are simply true, without needing truthmakers out in the causal order to underwrite them. Parfit's claim is that basic normative truths, something like suffering, in itself, is bad are true in exactly the same deflationary sense. Nothing needs to exist for either kind of claim to be objectively correct. What this changes, if Parfit is right, the entire CGA framing, which asks whether epistemic and moral facts survive the same ontological pressure, rests on a false shared premise. There's no fact whose existence needs defending or debunking. There's just a normative truth, true independently of any metaphysical scaffolding, exactly as 2 + 2 = 4 is true without needing to correspond to some object floating in space. This sidesteps Cuneo's queerness symmetry argument. There was never anything queer to begin with, on either side, and sidesteps quasi-realism too. There's no need to earn the right to talk as if facts were objective, because deflated normative truths were never less than objective. The cost. Critics, including some sympathetic to realism, argue Parfit's view is stable only by trading on the special case of mathematics, where deflationary truth without existence is already a somewhat contested minority position in the philosophy of mathematics, as flagged earlier in this essay. If mathematical Platonism turns out to be correct after all, if numbers really do exist as abstract objects, Parfit's central analogy collapses, and normative truths would need their own defense rather than borrowing maths. And even granting the deflationary move, some critics push back that true independent of any fact is simply a relabeling of what realists meant by objective moral fact all along. So Parfit may have renamed the disagreement rather than dissolved it. It's worth being precise about what follows. This is not another version of the CGA, and shouldn't be read as strengthening it directly. The CGA argues from a shared epistemic status, that moral and epistemic normativity are parity cases within the theory of knowledge. What follows instead argues from what objectivity does, for deliberation, institutions, and self-continuity over time, independent of whether epistemic norms are themselves objective. The two arguments happen to converge on realism, and a realist is entitled to use both, but they rest on different premises and can fail independently of one another. A related but distinct line of thought, closer to what Enoch elsewhere calls a practical, or deliberative, indispensability argument, says that objectivity earns its keep not primarily by being presupposed in belief formation, but by doing load-bearing work in deliberation, social coordination, and self-continuity. 4 strands of this argument are worth drawing out. Conviction versus whim. Deliberating as though there's a fact of the matter about what to do, rather than simply consulting what you currently feel like doing, gives conviction a kind of through-line that mere preference lacks. If what I ought to do just tracked what I currently want, there would be nothing to distinguish settled conviction from passing impulse. The objectivist framing is what lets someone say I still believe this was right, even though I no longer feel like doing it, which is a distinction ordinary moral life clearly needs. The right-wrong sort is social infrastructure. Nearly every institution humans build, law, contracts, courts, reputational systems, runs on a blunt sorting of actions and actors into wronged and wrongdoer, permitted and forbidden. This categorization isn't incidental to social organization. It's close to the load-bearing wall of it. If that sorting were understood by all parties as merely someone's preference rather than answerable to a shared standard, it's unclear what would distinguish a verdict from an opinion poll. Group agreement needs more than converging desires. Coordinating a group around shared desires is precarious, because desires wax and wane, diverge across people, and shift with circumstance. Coordinating a group around shared facts, even contested ones, gives the group something sturdier to hold on to than the current alignment of everyone's wants, which is part of why moral disagreement is conducted as disagreement about what's true, not as a negotiation over preferences. The wall of diachronic wrongness. When someone asks why can't I act differently today than I did yesterday, if my desires have simply changed, the ordinary answer isn't merely you'd feel bad but it would be wrong to do so now. A barrier that has to be reasoned through, rather than a preference that can simply be updated. This wrongness, once posited, behaves like a factual error rather than a change of taste. Much as an engineer who calculates that 1 + 2 = 4 doesn't get to shrug and say the math is just a matter of perspective, someone who reverses a considered moral judgment carries a burden of explaining the error, not just announcing a new mood. Where this leaves the anti-realist, the natural reply is that all four phenomena can be explained without positing mind-independent moral facts. Social coordination around a right-wrong sort can be secured by convention, shared self-interest, or contractualist agreement rather than by objective truth tracking. Group cohesion can rest on overlapping practical commitments, a Rawlsian overlapping consensus without those commitments needing to be true of the universe, and the diachronic wall may just be the psychological weight of having publicly committed to a judgment, which constrains us reputationally and emotionally without requiring an objective fact to have been violated. The math analogy is also more contested than it looks. Whether mathematical truths are mind-independent facts out there or human constructions is itself alive, an unsettled question in the philosophy of mathematics. So leaning on arithmetic is an uncontroversial case of objectivity risks, borrowing a premise that's exactly as contested as the one it's meant to support. A naturalist would push harder here than a first pass suggests. Convention, self-interest, and reputational weight are independently well-understood mechanisms, already needed elsewhere in the social sciences, while objective moral facts would be a new addition to one's ontology purpose-built to explain these four phenomena, and little else. By ordinary parsimony standards, multiplying explanatory mechanisms this way is exactly the move that should be penalized, not rewarded. So the practical indispensability argument may cost the realist more in simplicity than it buys an explanatory fit. Even granting the anti-realist's replies, though, the argument does real work. It shifts the burden from why think morality is objective, to why think all four of these practices can be fully vindicated without it, which is a harder question to answer cleanly than it first appears, and gives the practical indispensability line a genuine claim to sit alongside the CGA rather than merely restate it. A common misreading. Anti-realism is not logical positivism. It's tempting to fold contemporary moral anti-realism into old-fashioned logical positivism, since both share a science-first sensibility, but the two differ sharply on where the problem with moral language actually lies. Logical positivism, and its ethical offshoot, emotivism, held that moral statements are meaningless. Since goodness can't be empirically verified or established by definition, murder is wrong was treated as an expression of feeling, closer to a cheer, or a jeer than to a claim that could be true or false. Modern anti-realism, represented paradigmatically by J.L. Mackey's error theory, rejects that semantic move. Error theorists agree with realists that moral language is genuinely truth-apt. When someone says murder is wrong, they are making a real assertion, not just venting emotion. The disagreement is ontological, not semantic. The assertion is meaningful and false, because the world doesn't contain the strange, mind-independent properties required to make it true. This distinction also explains why error theory has survived where positivism collapsed. Logical positivism's verification principle was self-undermining. It was itself neither empirically verifiable nor true by definition, making it nonsense by its own criterion. Error theory avoids this trap by resting on explanatory parsimony, rather than a rigid theory of meaning. Psychology, evolution, and sociology can account for moral belief and moral language without needing to posit facts out there to make those beliefs true. A soft verdict, weighing the two sides without pretending the matter is closed. The realist's core move still seems to land slightly harder than the anti-realist's best reply to it. The reason is narrow, not sweeping. The instrumentalist and bullet-biting replies both work by describing why humans track evidence. Evolution wired us this way. Rationality is just a tool relative to goals we happen to have, rather than by showing that no genuine ut survives the description. But the moment an anti-realist turns around and says, so you should accept my error theory, because the evidence supports it, they are quietly reaching for exactly the categorical, non-optional force they just finished explaining away. The descriptive story is fine as psychology. It just doesn't obviously license the normative confidence anti-realists keep helping themselves to when they argue at all, rather than merely report. That said, the verdict is soft for real reasons, not just diplomatic hedging. Constitutivism's schmagency reply cuts both ways. An agent who genuinely doesn't care about accuracy hasn't been shown to be making an error, only to be a different kind of agent the realist finds hard to argue with. And I can't argue you out of thesis a weaker result than realists sometimes present it as. Quasi-realism offers a real third option this essay underweights. Blackburn and Gibbard would say the anti-realist doesn't need to earn categorical force by borrowing realist metaphysics. Expressivist theories can explain why moral and epistemic talk sounds and functions categorically without those facts being mind-independent, which quietly dissolves some of the self-defeat charge, rather than answering it. Parfit's non-metaphysical cognitivism complicates the picture further still, since it suggests the entire realist-anti-realist framing may rest on a demand that normative claims need existing facts behind them, that neither side should have granted in the first place. So the lean is toward realism, but on comparatively modest grounds. The anti-realist's skeptical package costs more in argumentative self-standing than realists' queerness costs in ontology, at least once quasi-realism is set aside as a live third path rather than folded into anti-realism generally. That's a much weaker claim than moral realism is true, and it's worth being honest that it is. The practical indispensability considerations above nudge in the same direction without adding much independent force of their own. They raise the cost of anti-realism's deflationary story about social life, but as the replies to that argument show, harder to explain away is not the same as impossible to explain away. Conclusion: the companions in guilt argument doesn't settle the realism debate so much as relocate it. Once the anti-realist tries to preserve objective epistemic standards while denying objective moral ones, they inherit a burden of explaining why the two domains come apart, and every proposed disanalogy, instrumentalism, constitutivism, bullet biting, draws a realist reply built on the same basic charge, that denying normativity broadly enough to sink morality tends to sink the very rational standing needed to argue for anti-realism in the first place. Whether that charge is decisive, or whether the anti-realist's parsimony ultimately wins out, depends on a prior commitment about which faculty, rational intuition, or empirical science, gets the benefit of the doubt when the two conflict.